This is Duke University.
I think it's a mistake for people to be dismissive of Russia as a declining power, because the truth is, as you look at history, declining powers can be at least as disruptive as rising powers. It is true, and I remember President Obama in a press conference 3 years ago or so was asked about Russia and said kind of dismissively, well, it's just a regional power. And my only reaction to that is it's a pretty damn big region across 11 time zones and, most of Eurasia. It is also true that Russia is vulnerable today in lots of ways. It's a one-dimensional economy, way too dependent on oil and gas. Corruption is a huge self-inflicted problem. Demography is a vulnerability as well. Not just, male life expectancy, but when you look at the reality that there are only 35 million Russians living in that vast swath of the earth that runs from the Ural Mountains across all of Siberia to the Russian Far East and the Pacific, sitting on just about everything in the periodic table of elements, and looking across a very long border at 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion Chinese. So there are reasons that Russians feel insecure sometimes. But I would also argue that Russia is still a potent player in the international system, still a permanent member of the UN Security Council, still the only nuclear power in the world comparable to the United States. That becomes a particularly combustible combination when you add in the sense of insecurity and grievance and sometimes aggressiveness that's personified by Vladimir Putin. Whether you agree with him or not, I think Putin, and at least in my experience, is absolutely convinced that he's the last thing standing between order and chaos in Russia. The old social contract between Putin and Russians when I was ambassador from 2005 to 2008 was basically, you all stay out of politics, that's my business. And what I will ensure are rising living standards and rising economic growth rates. That all worked fine until Putin came back for his third term as president in 2012. The economy had started to stagnate. So he needed to find a different kind of organizing principle, and he fell back on what came most naturally for him as a result of his professional training, which was a pretty nasty form of chauvinism and nationalism. A kind of us versus them mentality that fit in some respects Russia's historical experience, the kind of insularity and feeling of being threatened, the feeling of exceptionalism as well. And the truth also is, as Putin looks around him in the former Soviet Union, he sees a fairly target-rich environment. I mean, lots of societies that through weak political systems, corruption of their own, the ability to manipulate ethnic Russian minorities in those countries can be vulnerable to those kind of efforts from the Kremlin or from Moscow. And the Ukraine represents, by far the most important of those former Soviet states from the point of view of any Russian leader. In my own experience, it's very difficult to find a Russian in the political elite who can see Russia as a major power in the world without a deferential government in Kyiv, in Ukraine. And I think what Putin faced, at least from his perspective, a couple of years ago when President Yanukovych was pushed out and fled the scene, the political battlefield in Ukraine, was the situation in which he decided that what was second best to having a deferential government in Kyiv was a dysfunctional Ukraine. And so through the annexation of Crimea, which was the first response, and then efforts to destabilize the Donbass and southeastern Ukraine, the Putin government was able to manipulate a lot of what's happened in Ukraine. It seems to me that Ukraine deserves a lot more attention than it oftentimes gets, either from the United States or from our European partners, because it seems to me it's enormously in the interest, first and foremost, of Ukrainians, but ultimately in Western interests as well as Russia's long-term interest to see a reforming Ukraine, a healthier Ukraine that's anchored in a sense of economic possibility in the West, that can serve as kind of a bridge between Europe and Russia. And through its own gradual success, which I know was not a foregone conclusion, can create a kind of model of a healthy economic and political system that over time might be something that more and more Russians want to try to emulate. So there's a lot at stake, I think, because Putin, it seems to me, is betting on three things right now: that Ukraine is going to implode socially and economically, that the EU is going to get distracted, and he's always thought that Americans have attention deficit disorder, and the truth is he might be right about one or all of those things. So there's a lot at stake there in terms of helping Ukrainians to build, a healthier economic and political system.